The girl was known throughout the village, but not for the reasons she wished. Every morning when she walked to the stream with her clay pot, heads turned, whispers spread, and laughter followed her steps like a shadow she could not shake. Her dress, once a simple garment her late mother had sewn with care, had long since lost its shape and color. Time, countless washes in river water, and the rough handling of life's hardships had reduced it to little more than patches of cloth. It clung to her thin frame in uneven folds, torn at the hem, frayed at the sleeves, with loose threads dangling as if holding on for dear life. The villagers had given her many names, the ragged girl, the tattered child, and worse, but none of those names carried the truth of who she was. She lived at the edge of the settlement in a small hut that leaned as though tired from years of weather and neglect. The walls were made of mud that cracked with the dry season, and the thatched roof leaked during heavy rains, leaving her to patch it with banana leaves when storms came. She had no father to work the land for her and no mother to guide her hand. They had both been claimed by illness when she was barely old enough to fetch water on her own. An aunt had taken her in for a short while, but soon grew weary of the extra mouth to feed. Left to fend for herself, the girl learned quickly how to live on little, how to trade wild fruits for grain, how to fetch water for others in exchange for scraps of food, and how to work with quiet diligence so she might survive another day. Though poverty clothed her in rags, dignity lived in her heart. She did not raise her voice when mocked, nor did she return insult with insult. Instead, she bowed her head, smiled faintly, and carried on with her chores. She was gentle with children, often giving them the sweeter fruits she found even when she herself had only a dry crust of bread to eat. When an elder passed by, she would step aside and greet them respectfully, as though she carried an invisible crown that no one could see. To the few who paid close attention, it was clear that the rags were nothing more than an outer skin hiding a spirit strong, kind, and unyielding. Still, most villagers could not see past the fabric. Children giggled behind their hands as she walked by. Young women, dressed in beads and bright wrappers, looked her up and down with pity mixed with disdain, whispering that no man would ever want her. The men too mocked her openly. Some laughed that even the goats in the field wore better coats than she did. The sting of their laughter could have hardened her heart, but she refused to let cruelty take root in her. Instead, she whispered to herself the words her mother had once spoken. The cloth does not make the soul. A pot may be cracked on the outside but still carry the sweetest water within. Her life was simple, yet it was not without beauty. She woke each morning before the sun and stood quietly to watch its first rays spill across the horizon, painting the sky with pink and gold. She listened to the songs of birds and often hummed along, finding melodies in their calls that eased her loneliness. She tended a tiny patch of earth near her hut, where she grew maize and beans. The plants struggled in the dry soil, but she cared for them patiently, whispering encouragement as though they too needed hope to grow. When harvest came, however meager, she shared with those who had less, and the old women of the village sometimes marveled quietly at how such generosity could live in one who had so little. Her rags told a story the villagers thought they understood, a story of failure, shame, and unworthiness. But the truth was far different. Her rags were not the sign of her worth but the result of life's misfortunes she had endured with more grace than most could muster. Each tear in the fabric was like a scar from a battle survived, each patch a reminder that she knew how to mend what was broken. Though she wore them without complaint, the rags became the reason others believed they were better than her, blind to the quiet strength she carried. Yet, somewhere deep inside her, she held on to a secret hope. When she sat by the river, watching her reflection in the water, she sometimes imagined herself clothed differently, not in jewels or gold but in garments clean and whole, a dress her mother might have made if life had been kinder. She pictured herself walking into the village without laughter trailing her, and for a brief moment she felt the dignity within her rise, strong enough to silence every cruel tongue. Though her reality was poverty, her dreams were woven from threads of resilience, and they kept her spirit alive when all else seemed against her. In the days to come, no one in the village could have guessed that the very rags they mocked would one day tell a different story. They had seen only the torn cloth and not the girl inside it, and because of that blindness, they believed her destined to remain nothing more than a symbol of pity. But fate was already stirring in silence, preparing a moment where her outward appearance and her inner worth would collide in a way that none could ignore. For now, she remained the girl in rags, mocked daily, yet walking each step with the grace of someone who knew that even rags could not hide the brilliance of a soul meant for more. The news spread like wildfire across the land, carried from the town criers who beat their drums and raised their voices in the marketplace. The king had declared a royal festival, one grander than any held in recent memory. He wished for all his subjects, rich and poor alike, to gather before him in the great courtyard of the palace. Musicians would play, dancers would whirl, and feasts would be laid out on golden trays. The decree promised that the king himself would walk among the people, speaking to them, hearing their voices, and observing the worthiness of his subjects. To the villagers, such an event was no ordinary celebration. It was a chance to be seen, a chance to shine, and perhaps even to win the king's favor. Excitement swept through the fields and into the homes, echoing from door to door. Families began polishing their jewelry, traders unfolded bolts of bright fabric, and seamstresses' fingers flew faster over their needles than ever before. Mothers whispered to their daughters of the suitors they might attract if they caught the king's eye, while young men joked about which of them would stand out the most in their fine attire. For most of the villagers, the days leading to the festival became a flurry of preparation. It was not just about honoring the king. It was about outshining one another, proving who held the most beauty, wealth, and prestige. In the corner of this bustling community, however, sat the girl in rags. She had heard the proclamation just as everyone else had, though the sound of the drum announcing the decree had not filled her with joy. Instead, her heart had sunk lower with every word. She knew what awaited her. She had no silks tucked away in a chest, no jewelry passed down from her mother, no coins to offer the seamstress for even the simplest dress. All she had were her tattered garments, the same worn pieces that had already earned her daily ridicule in the marketplace. If her appearance drew whispers on an ordinary day, what shame would she suffer when she stood among villagers draped in their finest before the king himself? The villagers had wasted no time in mocking her again when the announcement spread. "Perhaps she will come draped in her blanket of holes," one of the women sneered as she compared fabrics with her friends. "The king may think she crawled out of a beggar's den instead of this village," another added with a cruel laugh. Even the children repeated their parents' taunts, chanting little rhymes about the girl's rags as they skipped through the dusty lanes. Wherever she turned, the words clung to her like thorns. Though she held her head low and tried to walk with quiet dignity, their voices pierced her heart. At night, while others sang merrily as they stitched their festival clothes, she sat alone by the faint glow of her fire. Her hands folded over the worn fabric on her lap, tracing the frayed edges, the thinness that could barely shield her from the wind. She wished for once she could blend in, stand among them without being noticed for her poverty. Yet she knew wishes did not mend cloth, nor did tears weave silk. All she had was the strength of her heart, her gentle nature, and her patience in the face of cruelty. Still, she could not ignore the decree. Attendance was not a choice. The king had summoned everyone. To defy his call was unthinkable. So the girl steeled herself. If she must endure shame, she would endure it with grace. She would walk with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every cruel laugh, every mocking eye. Let them whisper. Let them sneer. She told herself she had survived worse. But even as she tried to convince herself, a tremor of fear lingered in her chest. She imagined the villagers gathered in their splendid colors, their laughter sharp as knives when her figure appeared at the gates. She imagined the king's eyes falling upon her, not with kindness but with disdain. That image haunted her most of all. To be mocked by villagers was one thing, but to be dismissed by the king would cut deeper than she could bear. The days passed quickly, and with each sunrise the villagers' excitement grew louder. Gossip filled the air. Who would wear what, whose attire was most exquisite, whose family would stand closest to the king? The girl heard it all as she went about her small chores, her rags trailing in the dust, the sharpness of their words following her like shadows. And though she kept her silence, her heart felt heavy with a mix of dread and longing. Dread for the humiliation she knew was coming, and longing for something she could not yet name, something that felt like hope. By the eve of the festival, the village sparkled with anticipation. Lanterns were hung, drums rehearsed their rhythms, and garments of silk and velvet were laid out in preparation. Every corner of the community buzzed with life and color. Every corner but one, the humble dwelling of the girl in rags, where the fire flickered softly over her bowed figure. She whispered to herself as though to the night, promising she would go, promising she would endure, though her heart quaked with uncertainty. She did not yet know that destiny had already begun to weave its own garment for her, one far beyond the villagers' gossip or the reach of their cruel laughter. The morning of the festival dawned with golden light spilling across the rooftops, as if even the heavens wished to dress the world in brilliance. The streets were alive with color, women in bright wrappers embroidered with beads, men in robes freshly washed and pressed, children with painted faces laughing as they ran ahead. Music floated through the air, drums echoing like heartbeats of celebration. But among this sea of splendor, one figure stood apart. The poor girl, whose name few remembered because most only called her the Ragged One, stepped into the street with her tattered gown brushing her ankles. The fabric, faded and frayed, had been patched so many times that no piece of it seemed to belong to the other. The once white thread was now the color of dust, the edges torn from years of wear. Yet she held her head high, even as her heart trembled inside her chest. The moment her foot touched the main road, the whispers began. "There she is," someone sneered, elbowing a friend. "Does she truly mean to go before the king dressed like a beggar?" A group of women carrying baskets paused to laugh, their bracelets jingling. "Perhaps she thinks the king will mistake her for a servant and give her scraps." Children pointed with mischievous glee. "Look at her rags. Even the goats in the fields wear better coverings than she does." The laughter stung sharper than any whip. But still she kept walking. Her bare feet pressed against the dusty earth, leaving faint prints behind her. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though she were carrying stones upon her shoulders. Yet she would not run. She would not hide in her hut and surrender to their cruelty. When she passed the weaver's stall, the old man squinted at her. "Did you not hear the decree, girl? The king said all must come in their finest." He tugged at the rich cloth draped over his arm. "Your rags will shame the village before his eyes." She bowed her head respectfully but did not answer. She had no words to defend herself, no coins to buy fabric, no miracle to cover her. Only her dignity remained, and she clung to it silently. As she neared the marketplace, the mockery grew louder. Some villagers stepped aside dramatically as though afraid her rags carried a curse. Others held their noses as if poverty had a smell. Groups of young women, dressed in bright silk gowns and adorned with jewels borrowed or bought, tossed their heads and spoke loudly enough for her to hear. "Perhaps she wears those rags to catch pity," one said. "Or to beg for a husband who has no eyes," another added, sparking cruel laughter. Her cheeks burned, but she pressed forward. The road stretched endlessly before her, each laugh echoing in her ears long after she passed the mockers. For every face twisted in scorn, she reminded herself of the kindness she carried. The old widow she had fetched water for, the sick child she had soothed, the stray animal she often fed with the crumbs she saved. But no one looked at her heart, they only saw the fabric on her skin. The square where the festival was to be held loomed ahead, filled with banners, flowers, and the tantalizing aroma of roasted meats. 100 eyes followed her as she stepped into that space, her rags glaringly out of place amidst the grandeur. Some villagers covered their mouths in exaggerated shock, others laughed openly, while a few shook their heads in pity as though her presence dishonored them all. Still she did not turn back. The cruelest blow came when a boy, no older than 10, threw a wilted leaf at her feet and shouted, "Beggar Queen!" The crowd erupted with laughter so thunderous it drowned the music. For a moment her strength faltered. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, her throat tightened, and her hands trembled at her sides. But then she inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She would not let them see her break. With quiet resolve, she lifted her chin and took another step toward the palace gates. Though she wore rags, she carried herself as though she wore silk. Though they mocked, she walked with the dignity of someone who knew her worth lay not in cloth but in spirit. Unbeknownst to the jeering crowd, fate itself was watching. The cruel mockery that sought to crush her would soon give way to awe. For the festival had only just begun, and the girl in rags had not yet revealed the true glory hidden within her destiny. The day of the royal festival arrived like a sunrise clothed in jewels. From early dawn, the streets leading to the palace were alive with the sounds of drums, flutes, and laughter. Merchants decorated their stalls with bright fabrics and polished ornaments, while children ran barefoot, their faces painted with patterns of joy. The air carried the smell of roasted meat and honeyed cakes, mingling with the sweetness of flowers that had been woven into garlands and hung across every gate. The palace itself stood resplendent, like the heart of a great fire. Its high towers shimmered with banners dyed in scarlet and gold, and the gates were guarded by soldiers in shining armor, each bearing spears that glistened like captured lightning. Within the vast courtyard, fountains danced in rhythm, their waters scattering droplets that sparkled as though jewels had been cast into the air. Musicians played drums deep as thunder, while harps and horns filled the space with music that seemed to chase sorrow away. Nobles arrived one by one, their carriages painted with golden crests, their horses adorned with jeweled bridles. Men wore robes of fine silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the light, while women glided like visions, their gowns heavy with pearls and beads. Laughter flowed as freely as wine, and servants hurried about, carrying trays of delicacies, bowls of spiced rice, roasted lamb, and cakes dripping with syrup. Amid this sea of grandeur, the orphan girl entered quietly, her bare feet dusted with the dirt of the road, her frame hidden beneath rags patched too many times to be mended again. Where others wore crowns of gold, she wore a simple scarf faded by the sun. The moment she stepped into the festival grounds, whispers rose like a gust of cruel wind. "Look at her," one noblewoman hissed behind a jeweled fan. "Does she not know this is a royal festival, not a market for beggars?" Another laughed. A young man sneered, "Perhaps she thinks the king himself will take pity and clothe her." Everywhere she turned, eyes followed, mocking, measuring, dismissing. Some pointed openly, their rings flashing as they laughed at her rags. Children, dressed in silks finer than any cloth she had ever touched, tugged at their mother's sleeves and asked, "Why is that girl here? She looks like a servant who lost her place." The contrast was painful, as sharp as a thorn pressed against skin. Around her shimmered a world of light and color, yet she remained a shadow in its midst, her plainness more glaring against their brilliance. Still she did not retreat. Her heart pounded, but her feet carried her forward step by step, as though the ground itself commanded her not to turn back. She paused in the courtyard, where the king's throne rose upon a dais draped in golden cloth. He had not yet arrived, and the nobles continued to chatter freely, their jewels flashing like stars. None made room for her. Instead they crowded together, ensuring she stood at the very edge as though her rags might stain their silks if she drew too close. Yet even as humiliation burned, she lifted her chin. Her eyes, though weary, still held the calm of someone who had endured storms greater than laughter. She stood silent among them, a figure of poverty against the splendor, and though they mocked, she did not bow her head. And so the festival of splendor unfolded, music swelling, colors blazing, and nobles wrapped in finery, while she remained apart, a lone spark waiting in the shadows, unseen yet unyielding. For in that very contrast lay the beginning of a change none of them could yet imagine. The music of flutes and drums filled the air, rising and falling like waves against the palace walls. Laughter and chatter spread among the nobles dressed in silks of crimson and gold, their jeweled necklaces glinting like fire under the torchlight. Servants glided between them with trays of honeyed dates and spiced wine, while dancers twirled in shimmering veils. It was a night of splendor, meant to dazzle the eyes and stir pride in the heart. And yet, in the midst of such grandeur, a strange silence began to ripple like a disturbance in water. The king, seated high upon his carved throne, had shifted his gaze away from the dancers, away from the sparkling nobles, and fixed his eyes on the far edge of the gathering. There she was. The girl in tattered cloth, her dress frayed, her sandals broken, her hair bound with nothing but a strip of old fabric. She stood at the very edge of the crowd, shoulders drawn tight under the weight of countless stares. People whispered, some laughing outright as they nudged each other. "How dare she come here?" hissed a woman in emerald silk. "She is nothing but a beggar." Another smirked, lifting his goblet. Perhaps she mistook this palace for the market square. But the king did not laugh. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as though he were seeing something beyond the rags, something no one else cared to notice. Her posture was weary, yes, but there was a defiance hidden in the way she did not bow her head. Her chin lifted just enough to show she would not collapse before their cruelty. Each insult that reached her seemed to sting like a thorn, yet she stood rooted, enduring. "She is nothing," whispered a courtier near the throne, eager to explain away the curiosity in the king's eyes. "A girl from nowhere. Perhaps a stray. Shall I have the guards remove her?" The king raised his hand slightly, silencing him. He watched her with a quiet intrigue as if she were a riddle written not in words, but in scars, silence, and patience. Why did she not flee when mocked? Why did she not lower her gaze when laughed at? A lesser soul would have hidden, but she walked into the fire of shame and bore it without bending. That calm strength drew his gaze more than jewels, more than silks, more than all the gold crowns gleaming in the room. The nobles, noticing the king's eyes lingering, began to murmur uneasily. Some scoffed louder, thinking their ridicule would erase her from his notice. "Your Majesty," one old lord chuckled, "surely your eyes deceive you. That creature has no place here. She is less than dust." Still the king did not look away. For a fleeting moment the girl's eyes lifted and they met his. Her breath caught. She had not expected his gaze nor the weight of it. Where others saw shame, his eyes held something else. Something unreadable, sharp as steel yet softened by curiosity. The noise of the festival seemed to dull around her, fading into a blur, as if the whole hall had shrunk into the narrow space between her trembling stance and his steady watch. The girl felt her chest tighten. She had come prepared for ridicule but not for recognition. The whispers still stabbed at her, but the king's silence carried more power than 1,000 insults. And as the torches flickered, she realized something unspoken had shifted. The king's gaze did not move, and though no words had passed between them, it was as if he had seen through the rags, through the shame, into the ember of strength she had carried all along. The celebration had reached its peak when fate turned its gaze upon her. The drums beat like rolling thunder, the flutes shrilled and dancers spun in circles of flashing color. All around her, the air was thick with incense, roasted meats, and the perfume of nobles who shimmered in their jeweled attire. She stood at the far edge of the gathering trying to melt into the shadows, but the crowd had noticed her, noticed the one figure who didn't belong. It started with whispers sharp as needles. Why is she here? Whose servant let her in? She smells of dust, look at those rags. The girl kept her head low, clutching the frayed ends of her garment as though holding it closer might make her invisible. But the laughter grew, a wave rippling outward. Soon, the nobles began nudging one another, sneering, pointing fingers that glittered with gold rings. Push her forward, someone cried, and before she could resist, hands at her back shoved her into the open path. She stumbled, nearly falling, but the laughter only grew louder. The music faltered as all eyes turned to the sudden spectacle. She was forced along, one shove after another, until she was no longer part of the crowd. She was the center of it. And at the end of the path sat the king, his throne a cascade of carved ivory and crimson silk. She froze. The weight of countless gazes burned into her skin. Every step closer made her feel smaller, until her rags seemed heavier than chains. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild, trapped bird. She tried to step back but the crowd pressed in too tightly. There was no escape. A cruel laugh cut through the murmurs. Look at her robe. One tug and it will fall apart. The nobles roared with delight. Emboldened, someone reached out and yanked at the hem of her skirt. The fragile fabric tore with a loud rip. She gasped, clutching what remained, but the damage was done. More hands followed, each pull a deliberate cruelty, each tear a fresh wound of shame. The girl stood trembling, pieces of cloth hanging loose, the bare skin of her shoulder exposed to the jeering crowd. She heard them laughing as if it were the grandest entertainment of the night, as if her humiliation were another dance or song for their amusement. Her throat tightened, tears threatened to blur her sight. For the first time that night she wished she had never come. She wanted to vanish into the earth. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole so she would never again feel the sting of so many mocking eyes. Her mother's voice, long gone but never forgotten, whispered in her heart, "You are more than what they see." But at that moment, the words felt distant, faint against the crushing tide of humiliation. The music had stopped entirely now. The only sound was laughter, booming, merciless, echoing against the palace walls. She thought of running but her legs felt frozen. The crowd had trapped her in a cage of ridicule. And then she made the mistake of lifting her eyes. The king was watching. He sat still, expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her. She could not tell whether it was pity, curiosity, or scorn that lingered in his gaze. But his silence too felt like judgment. The rags that had once simply marked her poverty now seemed like shackles of shame. Her hair, tangled from the day's long walk, fell in wild strands over her face. She felt like nothing but a beggar who had trespassed into a world far beyond her right to enter. The nobles clapped their hands in mockery, urging the king to laugh. "Behold a gift for our lord," one man cried. "A queen of tatters," shouted another. The girl's chest tightened. Heat rushed to her face. For a fleeting moment, she believed this was the end of her story, that her life would forever be remembered only as the night she was torn apart by ridicule. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold the remnants of her garment together, but the fabric slipped through her fingers, shredding further with each movement. A bitter thought pierced her heart. They have stripped me of dignity before the king himself. I'm nothing now. And in that moment, utterly exposed and broken, she lowered her head. The world spun with laughter around her, and defeat seeped into her bones like ice. She could not imagine anything that could redeem her from such a fall. The humiliation was complete. Yet, though she did not know it, the very moment of her lowest shame was also the threshold of transformation. At first she felt the weight of every cruel gaze pressing down on her. The laughter echoed like drums in her chest, mocking her existence. Her ragged dress hung by threads, the fabric dull and clinging to her as though to remind her of every struggle she had ever endured. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the ground, away from their eyes. But then something strange happened, so sudden it felt as if the air itself shifted. A shimmer ran through her clothes, subtle at first, like moonlight brushing against still water. The laughter wavered, some falling into silence as they squinted, unsure if their eyes deceived them. She felt it too, a tingling warmth beginning at her shoulders, spreading downward like a gentle flame that did not burn but carried weight, power, and presence. Her rags quivered as though alive. Before she could even grasp what was happening, the frayed cloth began to glow, not with the dullness of dust and grime but with threads of light that pulsed softly, like veins of molten gold. The crowd gasped as the fabric seemed to unravel on its own, each strand dissolving into sparks, only to weave itself again into something new. The laughter ceased altogether. What replaced it was silence so complete that even the rustling of the wind seemed to hush in reverence. The dull brown of her rags melted into hues of deep royal blue, silk that cascaded around her like flowing water. Golden embroidery wound itself across the fabric as if invisible hands stitched the cloth in real time, weaving symbols of strength and heritage long forgotten. Around her neck, the collar reshaped itself into elegant folds, adorned with patterns that shimmered like sunlight upon polished bronze. Her sleeves widened gracefully, the fraying edges sealing themselves into smooth cuffs embroidered with stars. Her skirt lengthened, brushing the ground, not heavy but commanding, as though every thread carried the dignity of queens who had once walked the earth. Gasps broke out across the crowd, men and women pressing closer, some covering their mouths, others clutching at their neighbors in disbelief. "It cannot be," whispered one. "A beggar dressed in rags does not become a queen before our eyes." Another murmured, "Magic, she must have been touched by the ancestors." The murmurs swelled into a chorus of astonishment, their voices trembling with awe instead of cruelty. Even the children, who had earlier pointed and giggled, now stared wide-eyed, as if watching a story leap out of the old tales they had grown up hearing. She herself stood frozen in the middle of it, barely breathing, her heart pounding as she looked down at her hands. Where her fingers had once trembled, clutching the torn hem of her rags, they now held silk as smooth as water, threaded with gold that reflected the sunlight like fire. She turned her palms over, as though to confirm this was real, but the silk remained. No trick, no fleeting dream. A transformation had indeed taken place, one that did not just change her clothes but seemed to alter the very air around her. The king leaned forward on his throne, his eyes sharp and unblinking. His face, once composed and distant, betrayed a flicker of something else: curiosity, reverence, perhaps even recognition. His courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded before them. They had seen wealth, jewels, and silks countless times, but never had they witnessed a transformation born from nothing but rags. It carried a weight greater than mere finery, it was not the work of tailors but of destiny. The girl straightened, her spine lengthening as though the silks themselves commanded her to stand taller. The shame that had curled her shoulders inward melted away, replaced by a newfound grace that did not feel forced but natural, as though it had been waiting inside her all along. Where moments ago she had been a spectacle of pity, mocked and humiliated, she now radiated a presence that silenced an entire courtyard. She was no longer merely the girl in rags, she was something else, something greater, though she herself did not yet know what name it carried. The moment stretched heavy in the air as those who had mocked her just minutes before found themselves stripped of their laughter. Their voices faltered, their jeering died on their tongues, and their eyes, which once gleamed with ridicule, now lowered in shame. No one dared meet her gaze, their bravado dissolved as swiftly as morning mist before the rising sun. The very same mouths that had curled in cruel amusement now pressed into silence, their owners shifting uncomfortably, realizing the weight of their own pettiness. Whispers moved through the crowd, not of laughter anymore but of regret, a hushed current of guilt that spread from person to person like a contagious truth. Mothers held their children closer, ashamed that they had clapped when she stumbled, and men who had sneered just moments before turned their faces away, unwilling to be caught in their own disgrace. Even among the nobles, who prided themselves on being above all others, the shame was sharper. The jewels on their fingers and the silks on their shoulders suddenly felt heavy, dull, and worthless compared to the radiance that flowed from her. They had always believed that beauty belonged to them alone, purchased with wealth and guarded by lineage, yet standing before them was a girl whose splendor was not bought but bestowed, not sewn by mortal hands but woven by something higher, purer, beyond their reach. Their faces burned with humiliation, they tugged at their collars and straightened their gowns, but nothing could hide the truth that in her presence, their finery looked like shadows beside the sun. Some lowered their eyes, while others bit their lips, unable to accept that their pride had been shattered so effortlessly by what they once called filth. The silence deepened when the king rose from his throne. His figure towered above them, not in menace but in authority that could not be questioned. His eyes swept across the hall, first lingering on the girl in her shining garments, then on the people who had made her suffer. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the chamber, silencing even the faintest whisper. He did not shout, for he did not need to. The weight of his words pressed down with the force of truth. He declared that no person's worth was ever measured by the cloth that covered their skin, nor by the jewels they adorned themselves with. He said a soul's greatness was not written in garments but in resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength that endures mockery without breaking. His words struck harder than any sword could, for they pierced pride, vanity, and cruelty alike. The crowd listened, trembling. The nobles, who were used to praise and power, felt small under the king's judgment. The common folk, who had joined the laughter to please their betters, bowed their heads, ashamed of their weakness. Not one voice rose in objection, not one dared to mutter an excuse. The air was so heavy with silence that even the torches along the walls seemed to burn softer, as if they too were humbled. And in the center of it all stood the girl, no longer the victim of ridicule but the vessel of a lesson none would forget. Her silence spoke louder than their shame, for she did not gloat, did not mock in return, did not lift her chin in arrogance. She simply stood, radiant, untouched by their cruelty, proving with her very being what the king's words had already carved into their hearts. One by one, those who had laughed the loudest bent their knees, bowing not only to her but to the truth she embodied. The proudest nobles lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze, their pride crushed into dust. In that hall for the first time all were equal, not in wealth, not in power, but in the raw recognition that dignity cannot be stolen and worth cannot be mocked away. The silence that had begun in shame settled into reverence, a quiet that carried more weight than any applause. It was the silence of a people learning, perhaps too late, that laughter at another's pain always turns back into sorrow for the heart that gave it. And so they stood, hushed and humbled, as the girl's radiance filled the hall like dawn after a long bitter night. The king, still standing, fixed his gaze upon the young woman who only moments ago had stood in rags, mocked and ridiculed. Now, transformed by magic that no hand could explain, she shone with a grace that outmatched even the most lavishly dressed nobles. His voice carried across the great hall as he asked her to step forward. The murmurs of the crowd hushed into silence, all waiting to hear what she would say. Slowly she came forth, her head slightly bowed, yet her presence carried a dignity that silenced every whisper. The king's eyes softened as he asked her name and where she came from. With humility she recounted her story, how she had grown up with little, how her stepmother and stepsisters had burdened her with endless chores, and how she endured laughter, mockery, and isolation. She spoke not with bitterness but with calm, as though suffering had carved in her a strength no hardship could erase. The hall listened in stillness. Even the proud nobles who had moments ago sneered at her now found themselves unable to meet her gaze. The king leaned forward, listening intently, his expression growing solemn with each word she spoke. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, as though weighing her story against the truth of what his eyes now beheld. Then, in a voice firm and filled with admiration, he praised her. He declared that what stood before him was not simply beauty born of magic, but a spirit forged through patience, dignity, and resilience. He said that she had endured what many could not, yet she had not allowed cruelty to make her cruel, nor mockery to make her bitter. Her strength, he said, was greater than any robe or jewel, for it came from within. His words rang across the hall, and many lowered their heads, ashamed of how they had treated her. Moved by both her story and her quiet grace, the king commanded that she be brought gifts befitting her worth. Servants rushed forward, carrying silken cloths, ornaments of gold, and trays filled with precious jewels. Each gift was laid before her, not as a measure of wealth but as a token of honor, recognizing her dignity. The hall erupted into awe, and whispers rose again, this time filled with wonder rather than scorn. But the greatest honor came when the king motioned for her to be seated among the royal guests. Nobles shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the girl they once mocked was now to sit beside them as an equal, or perhaps as one above them, for her dignity had surpassed their vanity. Slowly she walked to the seat prepared for her, her steps steady, her head held high, as if she had always belonged among the honored. As she took her place, a hush fell once more. For the first time, the laughter and cruelty of the hall had been replaced with reverence. The king's recognition had changed the very air in the room. Where moments ago she had been an outcast, now she was a figure of grace, resilience, and quiet power. The nobles dared not speak against her, for the king's voice had marked her with honor. Those who once delighted in her humiliation now found themselves humbled by her elevation. And she, seated among them, carried herself not with arrogance but with the same calm dignity that had carried her through her struggles. In that moment, her story had shifted forever, from one of hardship and ridicule to one of recognition and honor, as the king himself had declared her worthy beyond measure. The whispers moved like restless wind through the crowd, 1,000 hushed voices circling around the girl who now sat in robes finer than anything the village had ever seen. Those who had once mocked her for her bare feet now struggled to meet her eyes, their memories replaying with a heaviness that settled in their chests. Mothers nudged their children to silence, fathers folded their arms in uneasy shame, and the young men who had once laughed at her weakness stared at the ground as though the earth itself was accusing them. Regret weighed on them all, for it was not just her beauty they had mocked, it was her very dignity, her worth as a human being. Some could not bear to remain in their seats. Slowly, timidly, they rose and crossed the space between them, their steps faltering as if each movement demanded courage they had long forgotten. They bowed their heads low before her, voices trembling with apologies. "We were blind," one said, his eyes brimming with tears. "We did not see the strength within you." Another added, "Forgive us, child. We spoke cruelty because we feared what we did not understand." The words tumbled out awkwardly, desperate, as though speaking them might erase the weight of years spent wounding her with scorn. Yet not all dared to approach. Many remained where they were, their faces pale, their hands fidgeting nervously. Their eyes darted toward her and then away again, afraid to be caught in the reflection of their own cruelty. To look at her now was to face themselves, to confront the ugliness of their laughter and the ease with which they had dismissed her pain. For these, silence became their prison, a heavy wall between guilt and absolution. Their shame was written in the way their bodies turned, in the way their mouths opened but no sound came out. They wished to vanish into the crowd, but the memory of their ridicule bound them tighter than any chain. The girl watched them all, the ones who came with trembling words and the ones who shrank into shadows. Her heart, though still tender from old wounds, did not grow hard. She did not gloat nor let vengeance cloud her face. Instead, she lifted her chin with quiet grace, her eyes carrying both the memory of their cruelty and the strength of her survival. When the first of the villagers knelt and asked for her forgiveness, she did not hesitate. Her voice, steady and soft, fell over them like a balm. "I forgive you," she said simply. "But forgiveness does not erase what was done. I carry it still, not as a burden, but as a reminder of who I had to become." Those words cut deeper than any rebuke could. The villagers bowed lower, some weeping openly, for they understood then that forgiveness was not forgetfulness. The girl would not erase their actions from history, nor would she pretend the wounds had never been inflicted. Yet she chose to rise above the cruelty, to hold her heart steady in mercy rather than vengeance. It was a strength none of them had ever seen, a strength they knew they could never have shown had the roles been reversed. The murmurs of regret grew heavier, filling the hall with a strange mixture of sorrow and reverence. They had laughed at her for walking barefoot, but now they realized her feet had walked paths of endurance they could never tread. They had mocked her silence, yet now her few words carried more weight than all their jeers combined. They had tried to make her small, but now she seemed larger than any noble or king, for she carried both suffering and forgiveness in her spirit. As she sat among the royal guests, her robes shimmering like woven sunlight, the villagers bowed their heads lower still. Some hoped that in time she might remember them not for their cruelty but for their repentance. Others knew that even if she never forgot, they could live the rest of their lives striving to undo their wrongs. And as for the girl, she knew their regret would follow them longer than her scars would ever follow her. She had forgiven, yes, but the memory of her suffering had become a part of her story, one that no shame, no apology, and no gift could ever erase. Her story spread like a spark carried by the wind, drifting from one village to another until it became a flame that could not be contained. Traders carried her name across dusty roads, telling of the girl who had been cast aside by her own people yet lifted high by the hand of destiny. Storytellers wove her tale into their songs, their voices rising beneath the night skies as children sat wide-eyed around the fires. Her trials and triumphs became more than her own. They became a living lesson for anyone who had been overlooked, mocked, or treated as less than they deserved. She became a symbol not merely of survival, but of the quiet power that rests in those who endure. Among the poor and forgotten, her name was spoken with reverence. Women who had been silenced in their households drew strength from her endurance, whispering her story when they needed courage to face another day. Men bowed their heads in respect, acknowledging that dignity does not come from wealth or lineage, but from the heart's steadfastness in the face of cruelty. Children looked to her as proof that misfortune did not define them. They too could rise from the ashes of suffering to a place of honor. Even the old, who had seen the shifting of many seasons, found themselves humbled, admitting that they had underestimated the power of resilience in its purest form. The arrogant and the proud found themselves shaken by her story. Chiefs who had grown fat on the suffering of their people heard of her honor in the king's palace and felt an unfamiliar discomfort stir within them. Some, who had once sneered at orphans and mocked the poor, could not meet the eyes of their subjects without shame. Her life was a mirror, forcing them to see the emptiness of their pride. What use was a throne carved from greed, when a girl who once ate scraps in secret was seated in glory by the king himself? The whisper of her name unsettled them, reminding them that greatness was not bound to bloodlines or power, but to the unseen weight of character. In the royal court, her presence became a light that others could not ignore. She was not just a guest to the king, brought in for a single moment of kindness. He continued to honor her in ways that astonished even the elders of the land. She was seated at the royal banquets, her place marked not at the edges but among the highborn, where her laughter mingled with the voices of those who once thought themselves untouchable. The king called her his daughter before his council, declaring that she was to be honored as one of his own blood. The courtiers bowed their heads in acknowledgement, though many whispered in awe that a girl of no name had risen to such heights. Her humility only deepened the respect she received. She did not boast of her fortune, nor did she repay cruelty with arrogance. When servants bowed before her, she thanked them softly. When nobles offered her gifts to earn her favor, she received them with grace, yet she remained unchanged. She still carried the memory of the nights she had been forgotten, the weight of hunger in her stomach, the sting of laughter behind her back. Those memories became her guide, ensuring that her heart would never harden in the face of her newfound glory. The king, watching her with fatherly pride, often said that her strength reminded him of the ancestors who had carried the kingdom through times of famine and war. He found in her a purity of spirit that no throne could buy, no riches could counterfeit. Whenever visitors from neighboring lands arrived, he would point to her and say, "Here sits the daughter of my heart, a living testimony that greatness hides in the places you least expect." His words turned her into more than just a figure of admiration. She became a voice of the kingdom itself, a story woven into its identity. As the seasons passed, her name traveled further, echoing in villages she had never seen, sung in markets by strangers she had never met. Mothers told her story to children as they prepared them for sleep, weaving her resilience into lullabies. Elders recounted her rise in gatherings, reminding the proud that even dust could hold hidden jewels. She was no longer just a girl who had endured suffering. She had become a living legend, her life a bridge between despair and hope, humility and honor. And yet, through all of it, she never forgot the soil from which she had risen. The crown of respect she wore was not made of gold or jewels, but of every tear she had once shed, every cruel word she had endured, and every act of dignity she had chosen in her darkest moments. Now, seated among the royal guests as the beloved daughter of the king, she shone not for herself alone but for all who looked to her as proof that hidden greatness, once revealed, could change not only a single life but an entire kingdom.